Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you found a place to get something to eat. If not, there's, maybe you grabbed a sweet and some coffee in the room. So I'm going to introduce our next moderator, is Jan Stewart, who is the Melvin R. Seiden Curator of Chinese Art at the Freer and Sackler Galleries. She rejoined the museums in 2014, coming back to America after holding the position of Keeper of Asia. That really means the head of the department. At the British Museum from 2006 to 2014. At the British Museum, in addition to her role in senior management, some of her major China-related projects included taking the lead in the creating of the Sir Joseph Hotung Center for Ceramic Studies, which features the renowned Sir Percival David collection of Chinese ceramics. Her work at the British Museum included supervising and curating numerous exhibitions, including the contemporary artist Xu Bing, and playing a role in the major exhibition on Ming arts in 2014. Happy to be back at the Freer and Sackler. She's been where she was a curator for over 15 years before moving to London. She's now specializing in curatorial work, focusing on Chinese art from the Tang Dynasty to the present, with a strong focus on ceramics, imperial arts, and the decorative arts. Her recent projects include new galleries in the renovated Freer, which I hope you've had a chance to see, and contributions to the catalog on Buddhist art, and more important, her work of co-curating with Daisy Wong of the Peabody Essex Museum and staff of the Palace Museum in Beijing, a spectacular lone exhibition that focuses on empresses of the Qing dynasty. This exhibition, accompanied by a catalog, is co-edited by Wong and Stewart, and it will open in Washington on March 30th, 2019. So we've got another year to wait, but it's coming. And prior to that, it will be on view at the Peabody Essex from August 2018 to February 2019. So Jan will introduce our speakers.
You can always count on a colleague to give you an extremely nice introduction. And I would like to return the favor by first of all saying that I think we as an audience want to acknowledge the extraordinary contribution of the Freer Sackler's CSR, Conservation and Scientific Research Department, that time and again have done, I think, really path-breaking work in being truly interdisciplinary. And the way we are wedding together conservation, scientific research, archaeology, and art history, I think is a paradigm, and I take my hat off to all the staff in that department, and especially to Donna for having the vision for this exhibition. So, thank you. Now, I also have some very distinguished speakers to introduce this afternoon, and the paper that we're about to hear, Lacquered Bodies, by Justin Ritzinger, is going to, I think, be very stimulating. He's an assistant professor of religious studies at the University of Miami. He received his PhD in the study of religion from Harvard in 2010. And aside from mummification, as if one can casually toss off, aside from mummification, his work focuses on modern and contemporary Chinese Buddhism. He is the author of a monograph on the reinvention of the cult of Maitreya entitled Anarchy in the Pure Land. And he has worked on astrology, engagements with evolutionary theory, and international monastic exchange. And surprisingly, as if that isn't enough, he also has worked on tourist development in contemporary People's Republic of China. He is currently working on an ethnographic study of a blue-collar lay Buddhist group in Taiwan. So let's welcome our speaker.
Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers and the staff whose hard work made this possible, and for inviting me, who is not only not an art historian, but also no kind of scientist, but rather an interloping scholar of religious studies and a modernist at that. So this is a very rare opportunity for me, and I'm very grateful for this honor. And now, as they used to say on Monty Python, for something completely different. At first glance, mummification would appear to be a strange practice for Chinese Buddhists to be involved in. It would seem to sit ill at ease with the popular conceptions of Buddhism as a rational and de-ritualized tradition. For those who know a bit more about it, it also might seem to contradict or conflict with doctrinal pronouncements about impermanence, as well as injunctions to detachment. Even the great chronicler of modern Chinese Buddhism, Holmes Welch, had trouble wrapping his mind around the practice, translating one common word for mummies, roshen, as meat bodies, saying that, quote unquote, it suited the repellent nature of the topic, even though he himself admitted that person in the flesh would be a more charitable translation. Nevertheless, appearances aside, this actually has a lot of historical continuity with the Buddhist tradition. It really, as it develops in China, is a novel combination of the cults of relics, classic examples of which we see here. These are crystallized bone fragments and that sort of thing from a cremation, and the cult of images, both of which have roots in India prior to their introduction to China with Buddhism. Over the centuries, whole body relics are called by a number of different terms. They're called whole body relics or quanshen sheli, bodhisattvas in the flesh, roshen pusa, as well as, intriguingly, flesh icons, roshen xiang. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to begin by sketching out the historical development of the cult of mummified masters, and then I want to shift to a kind of juxtaposition of the cult of mummies with their sacred cousins, the relic and the image, in order to draw out their unique qualities. And what I'm going to argue is that whole body relics display characteristics of both relic and image, but are distinct from either. And as a result of that, they enjoy a kind of doubled charisma. So the earliest cases of mummification in Chinese Buddhism are a set of 4th and 5th century mountain ascetics, Loggia, Jutanyo, Guang, and Shandao Kai. Very often these are referred to as the origins of the cult of mummified masters in China, but I would like to argue instead that they're really precursors. If you look at them in comparison to what develops later, they're really quite distinct. All of them are accidentally or naturally mummified. Loggia was the result of a failed cremation. The other 3 were mountain ascetics who simply died in their caves and were spontaneously preserved. When you look at the materials, and here I'm mostly working from saints' tales, you don't really find any theorizing of the wonder, right? These are considered to be remarkable preservations, but they don't actually make very much remark on them. They don't talk about what this indicates about their spiritual attainment. They simply say, right, 30 years later, there he still was, sitting as of old, or something like that. We also don't find very much evidence of a cult. Some people have interpreted this differently, but what evidence there is quite ambiguous, and it's arguable that maybe what we're actually seeing here is not so much a cult, but in fact a fascination with the strange, right, which has a long history in Chinese religion and culture. And we also find a lack of post-mortem miracles, right? They are preserved, this is wondrous, but that's kind of the end of the story, which is not the case with subsequent mummifications. So what I want to argue, and this is kind of the Big Bang theory of Chinese Buddhist mummifications, is that you kind of get almost the entire package at once, not with these obscure figures from the 4th and 5th century, but from one of the most prominent figures of the 6th, Zhi, who was the founder of the Tiantai school, which enjoyed a close relationship with the throne in the Sui dynasty. When Zhi passes away in 597, He is encoffined and entombed in a site that he selected on the southwest peak of Mount Tiantai. And at that tomb, a cult develops, and there are tales of wonders associated with the crypt. There are strange finger snappings happening, amongst other things. And because of this, the crown prince, the future emperor Sui Mingdi, has a little chat with Guanding, who is Zhi's successor, and he asks him, is there any scriptural precedent for opening up the tomb? Right? And so Guanding responds to him, quoting the Lotus Sutra, Shakyamuni Tathagata, with his right hand, opened the stupa of Prabhutaratna, and the 8 kinds of beings saw his whole body. Quanshen. This, of course, refers to the very famous chapter in the Lotus Sutra when the Buddha is preaching his sermon and a jeweled stupa appears in the air containing an extinct, ancient, yet somehow still active Buddha named Prabhutaratna, who shows up anytime a Buddha is preaching the lotus to say how wonderful it is. So when the tomb is opened, we find the crown prince echoing the kind of language that's found in the sutra about this ancient and extinct Buddha. He refers to him as a whole body relic and talks about him as appearing after all these years as if in meditation. And he states that this is proof that Zhi has reached advanced stages of the bodhisattva path. That is the path to Buddhahood. Right? So we find several key elements of the cult of mummified masters right here at what I would argue is the beginning. This is possibly intentional. At the very least, when the tomb is opened, there's clear evidence that they knew what they were going to find. There is scriptural interpretation, or scripture is drawn upon to interpret the significance of this wonder. He is referred to as a whole body relic, which is a term that is still used right down to the present. And you have a description of a cult, as well as post-mortem wonders surrounding that cult. Now, the piece still missing, of course, is lacquer. Lacquer starts to be used to preserve these mummified monks in the early 7th century. The first case is Daoxiu, who is an otherwise rather obscure figure. He dies and is spontaneously preserved, and local villagers, this is a nameless village somewhere in northeast Shanxi, cover his body with lacquered cloth, right, indicating that this has already become a sign of great spiritual attainment and needs to be preserved. More significant is Daoxian, who would later be identified as the 4th patriarch of the Chan or Zen school. Right? He is entombed in a stupa. His successor Hongren opens him up, again replaying this kind of drama derived from the Lotus Sutra and also from the example of Zhi. Now, lacquering these bodies, right, they cover them with lacquer-soaked cloth. Essentially, this is a third form of lacquer sculpture. We talked about wood core, hollow core. This is flesh core. It is, right? So this has several consequences, right? One is that it allows the indefinite preservation of the mummified remains. The mummified remains of Daoxin supposedly endured all the way down to the early 20th century. It allows them to be publicly displayed, and it also makes possible their relocation from these stupa mausoleums into monastic halls, into image halls or zhentang, and also into memorial halls or chongtang. Right? And there they can serve as the seat of monastic ancestor spirits and receive offerings appropriate to the abbot ancestor of the temple. Now, by the High Tang, we start to find a statistically improbable number of eminent monks being mummified. And what this would seem to indicate is that techniques are being developed to help ensure that this happens. Now, the early sources don't really say very much about what is actually being done, but we know that a 3-year burial period is common. They tend to be encoffined in a special sort of seated coffin called a kan, or sometimes sealed between 2 jugs, which is what you see here. This is an example from contemporary Fujian. And then in later periods, we don't know for sure when this started, but desiccating agents are added to the jugs, right? So here we see the mummified monk from Fujian being removed, and his body and what seems to be clothing are blackened because he's been packed in charcoal, right? They would be packed in charcoal or sometimes in salt as well. Now, even though they were engaging in all of this post-mortem processing of the body, this remained kind of a touch-and-go process. It didn't always work, and if you look at the tales of Buddha saints in China, and you kind of read between the lines, you can hear echoes of mummifications that apparently failed. So they'll talk about a given monk and say, oh, we dug him up, and he was just as if alive, and then 11 days later we cremated him. Which suggests that maybe they were trying to mummify him, and then after 11 days it became clear that something had not quite gone right, and they had to back out of that proposition. Nevertheless, the fact that there was lingering uncertainty about this meant that it could still be cast as proof of holiness, right? The fact that this succeeded, even though it wouldn't have to, even though in many cases it probably did not, indicated great spiritual attainment. We'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so what I would like to do now is shift from this kind of diachronic story of the development of the cult to a more synchronic comparison of the cult of mummified masters with the cult of relics and the cult of images to draw forth their unique qualities. Right, so we've already seen that from the time of Zhi, the mummified remains of eminent monks were considered to be relics. Right? Zhi was referred to as a whole body relic. He was compared to Prabhudaratna. Right here we see Prabhudaratna and the Buddha together in the jeweled stupa from the lotus. Right, stupas are the classic reliquary structure in Buddhism. Right, so this idea is that Prabhudaratna is a whole body relic rather than a dispersed or a disintegral relic, as the Buddha himself is said to have left. Right, so the idea is that this is a relic, and by the Song dynasty biographies of eminent monks, we hear discussions of these things as being perfumed with discipline, concentration, and insight. So the idea here is that a lifetime of spiritual practice has basically karmically transformed the body in a subtle way that is not proven until death, right? Either through cremation or through mummification, you sort of have the revelation of this transformation that has been going on over the course of a lifetime. Also, as Robert Scharf has pointed out, these are bodies transfigured, right? Both crystalline sharira and mummies, right? They are distanced from the corpse through a process of transformation and purification in which the impure corpse, prone to putrefaction, becomes a pure, immortalized body. Yet, whole body or integral relics are also quite different from their disintegral counterparts. These crystalline sharira, or sometimes pearl-like sharira, are often quite impersonal in Chinese Buddhism. They tend to be tokens of spiritual power rather than seen as bits of a particular body. Little attention is paid to provenance frequently, right? In part because many of them actually lack any real connection to a particular body because they come not from a funeral pyre, but are simply manifested in thin air, right? There are all sorts of stories about this, right? Kang Sung Hui famously prays for relics to manifest in order to convince a skeptical Sun Quan of the efficacy of Buddhism. He is rewarded by the appearance of relics in a bottle, shining this bright light. Right? Kuiji, when he pens a commentary, is said to raise his brush and 14 kernels of sharira simply fall from the tip. Right? And appearance tends to be focused on more than where these things come from, even in cases where their provenance is actually known or is legendarily said to be known. So for instance, in Ayuang Monastery in Zhejiang, you have a very famous Buddha relic that supposedly was put in China by the great Buddhist king Ashoka and then miraculously manifested from stone in the 3rd century. But what it really becomes famous for is changing appearance based on the devotion of the worshiper, Right, so I had the chance to see this in 2015 with a group of nuns, and afterwards, all the nuns talked about was what it looked like to each individual. Nobody said the word Buddha once. The fact that it was supposed to be a Buddha relic was eclipsed by its miraculous activity and appearance. But the most obvious difference between disintegral and integral or whole body relics is visual. Taken in isolation, sharira, right, these crystalline relics are indistinguishable from crystal, from glass beads, or pebbles, right? They are constituted as relics by the reliquary. It's that framing that tells you how to interpret these ambiguous objects, right? So reverentially placed in this bowl, those appear to be relics. If you put them in a plastic sack, right, it could be nearly anything. In this respect, whole body relics are more closely related to images, right? An image and a whole body relic are unambiguously a human figure. Lacquered and enshrined, a whole body relic looks much like any other image. Appearances notwithstanding, though, as a relic, the flesh body icon is nevertheless distinct from an image. Visually, they are quite similar, but in the case of an image, there is a gap between sign and signifier, signifier and signified, right? The image appears to resemble a given holy figure, but in order for that holy figure to be made present, there has to be a rite of consecration, right, which we see in this picture here. You have to have a ritual to make the Buddha present in the Buddha image, or perhaps enshrine relics in order to make the represented present. Mummies, on the other hand, are more than representational. You don't need to make the figure present in a ritual way because he is already present in the most literal and visceral way imaginable, right? His body is right there in the image itself, right? There is no gap. The represented is already present. As such, no ritual is needed. At the same time, as an image, it, like the crystal in Sharira, is framed, covered in lacquer and gold. Not infrequently after being filled out with clay, the mummified body, which might easily be an object of horror, is aestheticized, enshrined in the monastery among statues of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and portraits of departed abbots. It is constituted as an icon to be venerated. Now, as both relic and image, in miracle tales, it behaves in ways that recall both. The miracles that are associated with relics tend to be impersonal and reactive in character, right? First of all, you have the miracle of their existence, whether that's through a cremation or whether it's through a spontaneous manifestation. And subsequent wonders also tend to be evoked by worship from a devotee through the principle of ganying, or sympathetic resonance. Right. Most often they emit light, sometimes they change appearance, very often they multiply, so they exist in an unlimited amount. Mummies, like Sharira, sometimes manifest light, right? So Juri's tomb is said to have spontaneously opened in response to a penitent devotee who had circumambulated his stupa 1,000 times and prostrated 1,000 times, and light poured forth. The same thing happens with Sengqie's stupa during the reign of Song Taizong. The miracles associated with images, on the other hand, tend to be different in character. Where Sharira are impersonal and reactive, they are personal and proactive. They're protagonist in their own stories. Right, we already saw this morning the tale of the image who would get down to stretch his legs at night, leaving footprints. Other images are said to have sweated in fear when soldiers raided their monastery. And very often they would send dreams. So there's a Tang Dynasty tale about an image who sends a dream to complain that his fingers have not been finished. So there's a problem with his craftsmanship. And we see the same kind of thing with mummies as well. Mummies would send dreams to complain that there was some problem with their craftsmanship. One said that he was not finished underneath. Another complained of a problem with his mummification. And still another, Sengqie, right, put up a stink when he was enshrined in a place that was not pleasing to him. He was enshrined in the capital rather than his home monastery, and so he emitted a foul odor that befit his status as a corpse. Once he was moved to the location that he desired, then he emitted a fine fragrance, right, as better suited his status as a miraculously preserved master, right? And Huineng, in the modern period, sends a dream to Master Xu Yun, one of the most prominent Chan masters of the day, commissioning him to restore Nanhua Monastery, his home. Right. Because of this, mummies enjoy a kind of doubled charisma, right? They have the charisma of both a relic and an image, right? Robert Scharf famously argued that Buddhist relics have a particular allure because they represent the distilled corporeality of human beings, right? They recall our irreducible thingness and at the same time the mystery of life. Once living yet no longer, they allow the devotee to enter into a peculiar intimacy with a figure that might otherwise be rather distant. Now, Kishnik has qualified this by pointing out, as we've seen, that that relics in Chinese Buddhism are very often quite impersonal. They're not connected to any particular body at all. Nevertheless, as an intact human corpse, a mummy is inescapably personal, right? As such, I think they retain the kind of allure that Scharf was talking about. Images, too, were objects of fascination in medieval China. Whereas in the modern period, we're saturated with images, in the medieval period in China, they were still fairly rare, something that you encountered primarily in a monastery or in other sacred precincts. Lifelike but not alive, they presented themselves to many people of the time as endowed with agency and power simply by virtue of their uncanny nature. Right? And mummies shared the visual properties of images, but also, at least in the extant cases that I'm familiar with, add an element of palpable individuality. Right? They look quite distinct visually. This allure was one reason that whole body relics, like a famous relic or a numinous image, were an important asset for the monastery that enshrined them. Right? The mummy of Huineng, who we see pictured here, played an important role in establishing Nanhua Monastery as a major pilgrimage destination in South China. The subsequent mummification of Hanshan Deqing in the Ming Dynasty played an important role in its revival. The mummification of Jin Dicang helped to establish Zhouhuashan as one of the four great mountains of Chinese Buddhism. And they served as a kind of stockpile of charisma, right? They ensured that you would have a continuous flow of worshipers and of patronage, even when there were disruptions to the institution over the course of its history. And finally, they served as markers of distinction in the sort of sense that Bourdieu was pointing to. Besides being proof of holiness, these images, right, these flesh icons, were extremely difficult and expensive to produce. So having one showed that, in fact, you were the kind of monastery that could produce them. You had that kind of pull, that kind of power, that kind of patronage, the social networks to make this difficult object a reality. As such, it's no wonder that these valuable assets were often subject to contestation and even theft. In subsequent centuries, the cult of mummified masters continues to be quite important through the Ming Dynasty. In that period, Zhouhuashan becomes a major center, enshrining at its peak 8 mummified masters, and 3 of the so-called 4 great masters of the late Ming were all mummified, or at least were attempted mummifications. In the Qing Dynasty, however, it seems that a certain saturation had set in. They are said to have been common in the Jiangnan region, what's now Zhejiang and Jiangsu, and to abound in Sichuan. Right? The Qing court bestowed posthumous titles on some of these masters, giving one of them the elegant title of the Buddha who gazes at the river, Wangjiangfo. But another later on received the title 又是佛, right? Yet another Buddha, which suggests that perhaps the distinction of having one of these things had begun to diminish. In the modern period, it seems to have become more marginalized. You don't find any of the great masters of the Republic being mummified. It continues in Taiwan, but it tends to be the preserve of lesser known or second-tier figures. In the PRC, there used to be a large number of these, but unfortunately, flesh icons tended to meet the same fate as their wooden or stone counterparts during the Cultural Revolution. Many of these were destroyed. The practice has been revived in recent decades, but again, it tends to be relatively unknown figures. Yet these flesh icons, blurring the line between life and death, between sign and signifier, nevertheless remain objects of fascination. As the minor stir caused in 2015 by the flesh icon exhibited and subjected to a CT scan of the Netherlands demonstrates, as does the ooh that went through the audience last night when this picture was shown, we today, no less than Chinese Buddhists a millennium ago, are subject to the allure of this compelling combination of relic and image. Thank you.
An extremely stimulating paper, but there is time for only one question. Choose yourself carefully. I didn't mean to intimidate you. Denise.
I was unaware that they did something with clay to these mummified remains. Exactly how does clay play into this? Did they cover it with clay before they lacquered it?
They fill it out, and this is in later periods. In early periods, they say so little that I think it's rather hard to know for sure what is happening. But if we go back to this one, this is the same figure, right? So this is his face after he's been lacquered, and this is his face before, right? So there's a bit of filling out that's been done, right, with his face. It looks like his nose is not quite intact there. It's clearly been reconstructed. The ears seem to have been reconstructed. Some of them, so at the very, very beginning of the presentation. Right, so this one looks like it has not been filled out much at all, right? I mean, this is almost skeletal, but others have clearly been filled out prior to being lacquered.
So they take them out of the ground.
They take them out of the ground. Usually they're in the ground. Sometimes they're entombed above ground as well.
They fill them out so they look more human.
Yes.
And they lacquer.
Yes.
And then they gild them.
Yep, most of the time. Right, Huineng wasn't gilded, but many of them were gilded. In the Qing dynasty, sometimes they would extend the earlobes to make them look more like a Buddha. But yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, for our next paper, we're going to expand our cultural boundaries and looking at body relics in Tibetan and Mongolian traditions. Our speaker is Dr. Chandra L. Reedy, who is professor at the University of Delaware and director of its Center for Historic Architecture and Design, where she maintains the Laboratory for Analysis of Cultural Materials. She holds appointments in the School of Public Policy and Administration, the Art History Department, the Anthropology Department, and the Asian Studies Department. That's quite remarkable to span that. She is interested in the analysis and preservation of cultural heritage, including traditional crafts and technologies. Under funding from the National Science Foundation, the Werner Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training, and other agencies, she has carried out laboratory analysis and fieldwork in China's Sichuan province and Tibetan Autonomous Region, and in India and Japan. She has authored or co-authored 6 books, including Himalayan Bronzes, Technology, Style, and Choices, and Thin Section Photography of Stone and Ceramic Cultural Materials. Also over 75 journal articles and book chapters. While doing all this, she's also served as editor-in-chief of Studies in Conservation for the International Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works, and prior to that served as a long-term editor-in-chief of the Journal of American Institute for Conservation. She's also just returned from Cambodia, where with our Freer Sackler colleague, Louise Court, she was working on photography of ceramics for the authority of Siem Reap, Cambodia. So let's welcome our speaker. Thank you.
All right. Well, good afternoon. So before looking at the appearance and use of body relics, it's useful to examine their overall context within the burial traditions of Tibet and Mongolia. In Tibet, when a person dies, the first and most important step is to bring in a religious teacher or monk to assist the person in peacefully leaving the corpse and helping them find their way towards a good rebirth or reincarnation. Tibet is most famous for its unusual practice of sky burial, disposing of a corpse with the help of a celestial burial master in a special sacred area to be consumed by vultures. And it's the most widely accepted and commonly practiced method of disposing of the dead. And actually, after the vultures have consumed the flesh, then the bones that are left are pulverized and then mixed with tsampa, which is barley dough, it's made of barley flour plus yak butter. And you can make various symbolic and sacred forms. These are called tormas. And then they're left out for the birds to consume. This is really similar to what you see in most tantric Tibetan rituals and Bon Tibetan rituals, where tormas, these barley formed dough symbolic objects, are made and used during the ritual, and then afterwards they're left out for the birds to consume. And this is considered to increase karma for everyone because you're showing compassion by feeding the birds. So this sort of activity is not just for building up one's own good karma, but it sort of spreads good karma out throughout the world. However, other modes of burial are also practiced, and there can be great variation depending upon the region and local customs. The most common of these varying practices include earth burial, so burial in the ground, water burial, placing the body in a river or stream, fire burial or cremation, and stupa burial, so placing a preserved or desiccated body inside a large stupa. Earth burial is thought to be the earliest funeral practice in Tibet, predating the introduction of Buddhism, based on findings from Neolithic archaeological excavations, and the burial mounds of the early kings of Tibet are also well known. It's still practiced to a limited extent. Sometimes a body is buried because of disease, such as smallpox, leprosy, or tuberculosis. Or a non-diseased body might be placed underneath a pile of stones on a sacred mountaintop. Water burial is in some places considered a simple method for the poor or lower class people to dispose of a body, by placing it in a river or stream. It's also a typical practice in areas lacking vultures, and in that case, the rituals connected with it would be as religiously complicated as those of sky burial. The body is still accompanied by deities, in this case, water deities rather than air ones. Cremation is another funeral practice seen in some limited Tibetan areas where wood is more common or where this practice is simply the preferred method over sky burial. For ordinary people, the ashes will be spread over a mountain summit or in a river, places that are inhabited or visited by deities. For high-ranking monks or religious teachers, those ashes and bone remnants are instead mixed with clay and made into tsatsas, small clay objects that usually depict deities or miniature stupas, and are often then sealed into larger stupas during consecration ceremonies. Or they may be placed in protected places that are deemed to be sacred, such as in streams or on mountain ledges, in caves, on ledges along shrine rooms, or around prayer wheels. Stupa burial of a desiccated body is reserved for only certain very high-ranking incarnate lamas and involves mummification or preservation of the body, which is then placed inside of an elaborate stupa for worship. In Mongolia, earth burial and cremation are the most common funeral practices. However, mummification for placement of the body within a stupa is also known for the highest-ranking religious teachers. Whole body relics are uncommon, but do appear as a Buddhist practice in Tibet and Mongolia, specifically for the purpose of relic worship. The main purpose of relics is to aid practitioners in their devotion and spiritual growth. Stupa burial in Tibet with a preserved body placed in a stupa is reserved for only certain high-ranking religious figures, primarily the Dalai Lamas and the Panchen Lamas. There are several different ways in which the body can be prepared for placement in the stupa. The body first may be cleaned and perfumed, and then placed in a container filled with salt. After 3 to 4 months, the corpse is desiccated. Afterwards, the used salt lumps were highly valued and considered able to expel disease and bad luck, and were very treasured if you were lucky enough to get one of them. An alternative method of preserving a body was to bury it in very dry sand for about 3 years to pull out all of the body fluids. And yet another method was to slowly bake the body in a room with a stove under a specially prepared floor. However, the body was dehydrated. It was then covered with thin gold sheets and perfumes. It's been reported that upon the death of the 10th the 10th Panchen Lama in 1989, a total of 500 kilograms comprising 108 species of rare medicinal herbs were used in preparation of the body. The final step is to dress the body and move it into a stupa made of precious metals such as gold and silver, and covered with jewels and other ornaments, for long-term preservation and worship within a monastery or a temple. Sometimes the desiccation of the body, right after it's completed, an artist will reconstruct the outer appearance of the deceased teacher using clay and paint, leaving a sculpture-like mummy that then greatly resembles the former living person, and then this will be placed into a stupa. Stupas containing the mummified remains of the 5th and the 7th through 13th Dalai Lamas are housed in the Potala in Lhasa. The Potala itself is an architectural masterpiece that was built during the reign of the 5th Dalai Lama to serve as his main residence and administrative headquarters, and to house his personal monastery, and also to serve as a place of burial of Dalai Lamas. The stupa housing the Great Fifth is 60 feet high, with a framework said to be made of solid silver, covered with plates of gold that are studded with diamonds, sapphires, and other precious stones, giving it the name Ornament of the World. All subsequent Dalai Lamas, except for the 6 who died in eastern Tibet, are also housed in the Potala, although they were generally built on a smaller scale. Nonetheless, the funerary stupa of the 13th Dalai Lama, the last one made in 1934, is still 46 feet high and coated with 590 kilograms of gold, with the precious stone inlays being said to be worth 10 times the weight of the gold that was used. Raised, ornamented gold roof covers over the potala then mark from above the locations of the Dalai Lama funerary chapels in the building below. The mummified remains of the former Panchen Lamas were installed at Tashi-Lampo Monastery. These were also in the form of tall stupas made of gilded copper, ornamented with turquoise and coral, each housed in a dedicated chapel. They were topped by a statue of the deceased Panchen Lama and surrounded by wall paintings and tankas representing scenes from the lives of members of the lineage. Offerings from visitors are placed along the front. Sky burial is a usual funeral method for monks and teachers at Tashi-Lampo other than the Panchen Lamas. 2 mummifications with stupa burial have been reported at Sakya Monastery, where their remains were housed in stupas within temples there. One is the founder of the monastery, who died in 1102, and the other is for a member of the lineage who died in the 17th century. All other members of the Sakya ruling lineage were cremated. Their bones were then pulverized and mixed with medicinal substances, and the resulting particles, as well as the remainder of the body ashes, were then mixed with clay and made into thousands of tsatsas. These were placed in a large, and this would typically be 10 feet in height, stupa of gilded copper within a temple at Sakya Monastery, the Lakhang Chenmo. Or they would be placed in the river or on the mountains surrounding the monastery. It's been proposed that one of the earliest places for preserving whole body relics in Buddhism was perhaps Mongolia and other parts of Central Asia, where supposedly a very dry climate could create the conditions for natural mummification. Indeed, funerary stupas enshrining the mummies of great lamas and reincarnations were considered in Mongolia to be precious relics that turned a monastery into a local pilgrimage center. For example, a dozen monasteries linked to the supreme spiritual authority of the Gelugpa lineage in Mongolia of Tibetan Buddhism, who lived from 1635 to 1723, are said to enshrine some of his relics and relics of his reincarnations. And so, as a result, they attracted pilgrims from all over Mongolia. He died while on a visit to Beijing at age 88 and was embalmed there, and then the body returned to Mongolia to complete mummification. It's also said that the 6th Dalai Lama, who died outside of central Tibet, was mummified and enshrined at the Barung Kade Monastery of Inner Mongolia. This monastery was built by one of his disciples, but it's not been confirmed that this was actually the mummy of the 6th Dalai Lama, and it's said to have been destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. Potsnayas discussed in detail the burial of reincarnated lamas in Mongolian Buddhism. Some were cremated in an elaborate procedure. The ashes were then mixed with clay and used to make small statues that were placed in a specially built chapel at the burial site. Sometimes it's considered important to preserve the body in the form of a mummy. And in those cases, after initially rubbing the body with perfumes and other liquids, salt was piled over the entire body. After about 2 months, the body would be completely dry. It was then clothed, the face gilded, and the eyebrows, mustache, and lips ornamented with designs, while the eyes were left shut. This body relic was then placed in a shrine for honor and worship. There also seems to be a tradition in Mongolia of body preservation and burial for the elite. For example, Zhukovskaya discusses some tombs of pre-revolutionary Mongolia. The bodies were placed on top of aromatic juniper branches in wooden sarcophagi within huts that were constructed on stone foundations. The bottom of the sarcophagus was covered with juniper, and the remainder of the space within it was filled with rock salt. Salt was known to be a good preserver, and it's speculated that the goal was actually to preserve the corpse from becoming dislocated, so this was not mummification to create a body relic. An interesting exception to reserving desiccation for certain very high-ranking incarnate lamas is also seen in a few places in Tibet. In the past, in Lhasa, if an infant died in the first year, the body was sometimes desiccated, but in a manner different from that used for mummification of incarnate lamas. The corpse was placed in a clay pot and suspended from the ceiling of the ground floor of its parents' home. Desiccation occurred through contact with the dry air over about 8 to 9 months. The mummified body was then cremated, and the ashes used in the making of clay tsatsas, which were then left on mountain ledges near Lhasa. The clay pot was disposed of and not used again. A similar practice occurred at Sakya, but only for the firstborn child of a ruling house if it died in infancy. The corpse was placed in a silver urn, covered with salt, and the urn was then covered with a lid and left on the ground floor of a storeroom indefinitely. And this procedure was thought to ensure that the mother could bear more children and therefore ensure continuation of the ruling lineage. We've already seen that ashes or bone fragments of important teachers were sometimes mixed with clay and used in the production of flat tsatsas with deity images or miniature clay stupas. Relics have been defined as any piece of the material body, a tooth, bone, dried flesh, or crystalline remnant of cremation, or material items associated with the venerated person, such as clothing or other possessions. And several scholars have emphasized that the purpose of bones and other relics is not just to memorialize the dead teacher, but to provide continuing opportunities for enlightenment by practitioners. So contemplating the various stages of decomposition of the corpse helps to understand the impermanence of a person's physical form. Tsatsas are small clay objects made by stamping wet clay or by pressing it into wooden or metal molds, and then these are sun-dried. Most have images in relief that may include one or more deities, religious teachers, or shrine depictions. They can have a variety of functions. It's often reported that the sandy clay used to make them can have the ashes or bits of bone from a deceased holy person incorporated, although such tsatsas would usually be placed in stupas or other holy places in contrast to the more widely available ordinary tsatsas. Materials such as fibers have been found in some analyzed tsatsas, and it's possible that those items have some significance to a particular teacher, but that can only be speculation. Highlighting the usefulness of ethnographic work to better understand materials found inside tsatsas is a group of tsatsas recently made in Dharamsala, into which cut-up animal fur was added. And if we encountered this in later material analysis of the tsatsas, it would be a puzzling find. The head craftsman in this workshop said that on this occasion he was making 1008 stupa-shaped tsatsas for the Tibetan government in exile. To make them especially sacred, he chose to use cut-up animal furs, adding them into a hollow he formed in the center of each small stupa. He considered this batch of fur material to be especially sacred because of the reason it was collected. Recently, the Dalai Lama asked nomadic Tibetans to stop wearing fur and skins for the sake of compassion for the endangered wild animals of Tibet. And fur clothing had become more fashionable in Tibet, much more than in the past, some say because of Western and Chinese influences. And yet, at the same time, the greater availability of modern synthetic materials means that wearing fur is no longer necessary. So cutting up the old fur garments and sending them in bags to the Dalai Lama was then seen as a way of quietly expressing devotion and the idea of compassion that's so central to Tibetan Buddhism. So these fur remnants are seen as carrying great spiritual power, and they're also very strongly associated with the current Dalai Lama. In addition to using ashes and bone fragments to make tsatsas, these partial body relics are also sometimes found inserted into copper alloy statues or small metal stupas during a consecration ceremony. Before a sculpture can be used in Tibetan Buddhism, a consecration ceremony first purifies it and makes it suitable for habitation by the Buddha or another deity. The deity is then invited to enter the statue. Materials of a wide variety of different things can be inserted during this ceremony, whatever is deemed to be suitable for the particular situation and really to increase the holiness of the statue. Then when those objects are sealed into the statue by a base plate, the deity itself is also sealed inside, making the statue a living representative of the Buddha, and now a very holy object that must be treated with great respect. While bodily relics may be placed inside during the consecration ceremony, only relics from a very high-ranking teacher would receive this treatment. The wide range of types of objects that may be placed inside of a statue reflects the fact that not just bodily relics, but also relics of contact, things that were associated with that teacher or which he or she might have once used, are also suitable to put inside. Western collectors or museums who have opened consecrated statues to study the interior objects have found pieces of bone, charcoal, which may be from a cremation, bone powder, ashes, skull fragments, teeth, and hair. Also found were a wide range of small objects that may be relics of contact or simply items associated with a particular teacher. However, scholars have not been able to interpret these findings at more than a very superficial level, and the result is desecration of the sculpture. So, therefore, opening when not absolutely necessary for conservation reasons is quite ill-advised. And in the words of one Tibetan teacher, opening a statue for the sake of study is like, quote, tearing out the guts of a living being, unquote. And now you've completely desecrated the sculpture. It no longer holds any meaning. Imaging techniques may help to clarify some of the contents without disturbing them. And Yale Bentor has rightly argued that the best way to gain information about consecration ceremonies and objects is through ethnographic study, where one can examine the entire process and ask questions. In Mongolia, too, body relics of a holy lama were used as an object of worship to make the sacred person more present. Humphrey and Eugene described the efforts to bring the cremated remains of the 8th Mirgan Gagin into his monastery in Inner Mongolia. They were placed in a small brass stupa and ultimately put into the Temple of Relics in the monastery. The woman who had been caring for the Gagin when he died retained a tooth and objects that had been in contact with him, and these were placed in a second small brass stupa for worshiping at a shrine she set up in her home. While mummification was sometimes practiced in Tibetan Mongolia, the practice was rare and was reserved for a few categories of high incarnate Buddhist teachers. The preserved body relics were placed in stupas made of precious metals and ornamented with precious and semi-precious stones. These stupas were in turn placed inside a shrine within a temple. More common was the cremation of a revered monk or teacher. The resulting ashes and bone fragments were often mixed with clay and made into tsatsas that were usually placed inside a small stupa and housed in a shrine, or were distributed to sacred places. Occasionally, remnants of a cremation were placed directly in small metal stupas or metal statues. These were likely originally housed on an altar or in a monastery shrine room. Some of these relics have been disturbed or disappeared over time due to political events and modern collecting practices. While some written texts provide contextual information and non-destructive imaging can provide additional data, an excellent way to more fully understand current and past practices regarding body relics is ethnographic observation and interviews with practitioners when possible. There's much more we can learn about both Tibetan and Mongolian body relic ideas and practices. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful and on-time paper. So there is time for at least one question. Well, it was such a fulfilling paper that people will catch you later for things as they percolate in their minds. Thank you. Our next paper is continuing a geographical sweep, and we're going to look at the style and techniques of dry lacquer sculpture in Japan. Dr. Mai Sarai is a curator for the Tokyo National Museum, having taken on that position last April. Before that, she worked for the Tokyo National Research Institute for Cultural Properties, which is conveniently located next to the Tokyo National Museum, and that geographical proximity, I think, suggests a lot of what she's done of working between those two institutions, now being focused at the museum. Dr. Sarai's specialty is Japanese Buddhist sculptures, and that's been taking a lot of her time recently as she prepares a special exhibition that will open this October that focuses on the famous sculptors Kaikei and Jokei, who are, of course, the artistic successors of Unkei, the most famous sculptor in the 13th century. So she's very well positioned to bring new insights to us. Let's welcome our speaker.